The Earth has gone through 5 mass extinctions so far, the last being 66 million years ago when a massive asteroid collided with Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs. In recent years, scientists have rung the alarm of an incoming 6th extinction as climate change worsens. For many species, this grim shift is already affecting survival rates. Numbers of once thriving populations are quickly declining. Currently, more than 41,000 species are under the threat of extinction, according to the International Union for Conservation of Nature. In our lifetime, endangered animals like the black rhino, Sumatran tiger, and mountain gorilla are likely to fade away into memory. Professor and conservationist Michael Webster says that this rate of extinctions is concerning. But people need to keep a positive outlook. One good piece of news is that some organisms are finding ways to adapt amidst this changing landscape.
Tigers used to have really broad ranges across Asia, and in the last few centuries, they have gotten to be much, much rarer because a lot of their habitat has disappeared. And even in places where their habitat still exists, a lot of them have been hunted largely for an international black market in tiger parks. And so because of that, people have raised the alarm that if we aren't careful, we run the risk of losing tigers from the planet. In the book, I tell the story of a particular tiger and a couple of the parks in India where this tiger was born, and then later in its life, it moved between one park and the other. And it happened in the context of India really spending a lot of time and effort to trying to figure out how to manage tigers, having had some bad experiences like having tigers entirely hunted out of some of their parks, but also showing what tigers are capable of, that when we leave them alone and give them some habitat, they can actually rebound really quickly and their populations can go up and they can refill these parks to the point where they're quite abundant.
That's Michael Webster, an expert in ecology, biodiversity conservation, and natural resource management. He's a professor of practice in the Department of Environmental Studies at New York University and the author of The Rescue Effect.
The life of a tiger is not necessarily easy, and particularly when they start leaving parks and interacting with people, there's a lot of danger for tigers. You try to imagine having a tiger in your backyard, you would probably be pretty concerned by this event. Well, people who live around tigers are understandably somewhat concerned about these animals. So when tigers do decide to leave their parks, it can create the possibility for conflict between people and tigers, which isn't good for anybody. One of the possible solutions for this is to use what are called wildlife corridors, which are sort of strips of land that are left largely for the use of nature that can connect different parks to each other. Think of them as like little highways between parks that allow animals like tigers to travel from one place to another without necessarily going into croplands or going into towns. If they're capable of doing that, if they have these corridors, they're much more likely to reduce their potential conflict with people.
The widespread demolition of rainforests, prairies, and other natural habitats have been a huge contributor to extinction. Without these ecosystems, species have nowhere to go, are lacking food, and naturally collide more with humans. On top of this, climate change has also added another layer of complexity. For instance, take the mountain pygmy possum that lives in the Australian Alps and relies on the seasonal snowfall in the winter.
In the 1960s, some skiers discovered this strange little creature and was a new species, at least new species known to be alive. It had been seen before in the fossil record, but nobody knew that there were living examples of it around. And so there was quite a lot of excitement finding this little marsupial, and it turns out that it hibernates under the snow in the winter. Well, in the last 60 or so years since this species was discovered, people have started to get more and more concerned that it may actually go extinct now. And a lot of the reason why it might has to do with climate change. In particular, its ability to live on these mountaintops is at risk because the snowfall is changing, and the snow actually acts as an insulation for these little mammals when they hibernate in the winter. Without as much snow, they're actually getting too cold in the wintertime, and some individuals are freezing and starving to death. The concern is that if the trend around warming climate continues, these animals are eventually going to go extinct because their habitat is no longer available.
Webster says that this environmental change has no easy solution. It's not feasible to transport snow or make it warmer. So, where do they go?
In the case of the mountain pygmy possum, people are starting to ask questions about whether we should purposely move them to different locations where they haven't lived anytime recently to establish new populations in the hopes that we can avert extinction. This creates sometimes controversy in conservation because it means deliberately introducing a new species, which is something that people often try not to do in conservation. And so we're sort of faced with a choice that is exemplified by this animal around should we move it and accept any potential risk of moving it, or should we not move it and accept a different set of risks? And I think these sorts of dilemmas are going to be more and more common in conservation, especially as the climate continues to change.
This is just one of the many challenges out there. If humans don't intervene, the probability of extinction is high. Webster highlights another species in Australia that was too far gone and went extinct in 2016 due to climate change.
This creature was called the bramble key malomies, and it was a little rodent that just lived on this one island called Bramble Key. And it was an herbivore, so it ate plants on the island. The problems for the malomies started to happen as sea level began to rise, and its low island started getting inundated with salt water. When there was a particularly high tide or a high tide combined with a storm, the fresh water that accumulates on an island like this would get mixed in with salt water. And that salt water was actually starting to kill the plants. And so the concern was that if this happened enough times and all the plants died, that the malomies would starve to extinction. There was actually a management plan that recognized this and recognized the need to save this species, probably by relocating them to another location. Unfortunately, they didn't move fast enough. And lo and behold, the plants on the island died and the last of the malomies disappeared and went extinct.
And this is an all too common theme in conservation. Sometimes humans step in too late, and the situation is past the point of repair. Webster points out that while some species need more of an active intervention, others can adapt largely by themselves.
We've used to think about evolution as something that only took place over really, really long periods of time. But it turns out that evolution can actually happen very quickly under the right conditions. And those right conditions are that there's some diversity in organisms out there. They have different combinations of genes, and those genes might make them better or worse at dealing with an environmental change. If you look, for example, at corals, in corals, different individual corals have different abilities to deal with high temperatures. And if that ability is related to their genes, what happens when you get a high temperature event that causes bleaching and kills some corals, if other ones survive, there's been selection. And those surviving corals may be better at dealing with higher temperatures, and their offspring may also be better at dealing with higher temperatures. And so if that's happening in the environment, then it's an example of evolutionary rescue, where evolution in this case is driving the ability to survive at higher and higher temperatures.
Although the ability for organisms to naturally adapt is promising, Webster says that people shouldn't assume that everything will sort itself out.
The rescue effect in nature is strong, and we should celebrate the fact that it's strong because it means that many, many different organisms are adapting on their own already to the changes that were created. But it's also not all powerful. It has its limits, and we can see that with particular species, especially the ones that we think of as endangered or critically endangered. For them, the rescue effect is not kicking in fast or strong enough to help them through the changes that they're experiencing. And so one question is, how do we as people help nature adapt to our changing world? And I would argue there's a few different things we can do. One of the most important, probably the most important, is to try and figure out how to slow down the rate that the world is changing, because that rate is really what's going to make the difference for many organisms in terms of whether or not they can adapt. Probably the highest priority for this globally is dealing with climate change.
And everyone plays a role in this. How you vote, your carbon footprint, where you put your money, and more all make a difference in slowing climate change. There are also organizations that help endangered species that you can support. Some notable names are the World Wildlife Fund, the Jane Goodall Institute, and the International Rhino Fund. To find out more about this topic and our guest, Michael Webster, visit viewpointsradio.org. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri, studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. Coming up next week.
Having the breakdown of the Ticketmaster platform is really evidence of how poorly functioning a monopoly system is.
How the Taylor Swift Ticketmaster debacle has sparked a larger conversation. Then,
a Gen Zer with blue hair is going to come through the door. A Gen Zer with sleeves of tattoos is going to come through the door.
The ways in which Gen Z are breaking societal norms and stereotypes. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.